Heights and secrets. The wind blew strongly at the top of the skyscraper. 100 meters above the ground, the scaffolding swayed gently, keeping pace with the movement of the painters who, with their brushes and rollers, were transforming a monotonous block of concrete into a living work of art. Diego adjusted his harness and glanced down. From there, the city stretched out like a carpet of lights and shadows. It was his first week at the company Incredible Heights, which specialized in painting gigantic buildings around the world. It was not an easy job, but he loved the adrenaline of being suspended in the air. "Hey Diego," Carolina, one of the most experienced members of the team, shouted. "Don't get so distracted, or you'll end up painting the sky instead of the wall." Diego smiled and shook his head. Carolina was right. Here, a second of distraction could mean a poorly made line, or, worse yet, an accident. Working with her and the others on the team, such as Ramiro and Javier, meant learning quickly and adapting. The team had been sent to Dubai to paint the facade of a luxury hotel. A large and well-paid project, but with a tight schedule. Ramiro, the leader of the team, had been clear from the beginning. If we want them to keep calling us, we must do an impeccable job. The routine started early. After checking the equipment and making sure that the safety lines were secure, the team ascended to the scaffolding. They painted, joked, discussed life, and dreamed about the next destinations where they would work. However, that morning everything changed. While Diego was mixing a new batch of paint, Javier, a veteran of the trade, seemed to have a moment of doubt. He had been strangely quiet since breakfast. "Everything okay, Javier?" Carolina asked. Javier nodded, but his expression remained tense. Then, as if he wanted to change the subject, he said, "Ramiro, I think the compressor pressure is not stable." Ramiro frowned. "I checked everything before starting. But if you're worried, let's take a look." The two descended to the lower level of the scaffolding, while the others continued painting. Then, something unexpected happened. A crash shook the air. Something heavy fell from the upper floor. Diego's paint bucket, half full, overturned and a cascade of bright blue color descended down the facade of the hotel. The disaster was visible from the street. Diego felt his blood run cold. The noise attracted everyone's attention, and in a matter of seconds, Ramiro came back up with his eyes lit with anger. "Tell me it wasn't you," he exclaimed. Diego wanted to answer, but the knot in his throat paralyzed him. Javier ran a hand over his face and murmured, "This is bad. Very bad." Carolina approached and squeezed Diego's arm in support. "We can fix it," she said, although there was a hint of doubt in her voice. Ramiro took out his radio and called the project supervision. The voice on the other end sounded alarmed. This could mean delays, penalties, and even the dismissal of someone. From below, the blue stain on the hotel's facade was impossible to ignore. An error of that size could cost them dearly. They all exchanged tense glances, asking themselves the same question. How do we fix it before it's too late? The answer was not simple. And worst of all, someone knew more than they were saying. The stain of fear. The entire team remained silent, observing the large blue stain that now dominated the facade of the luxurious hotel. From below, the supervisors were already beginning to point and talk among themselves, their gestures denoting concern and anger. Such an error could mean the end of the contract and, worse yet, the loss of jobs. "We have to do something quickly," Carolina said, taking the initiative. Ramiro nodded, shaking his head in frustration. "The first thing is to find out what happened. Diego, what exactly did you do before the bucket fell?" Diego swallowed. I was just mixing the paint. I don't know how it could have fallen. I swear I secured it well on the scaffolding." Javier, who had been tense all morning, stepped forward. Maybe it was the wind, or an error in the scaffolding supports. Ramiro sighed. "Whatever it is, we have to fix it before they kick us out of here." The sound of a walkie-talkie interrupted the conversation. The supervisor's voice boomed with authority. "Ramiro, come down now. We need an explanation." Ramiro went down without protesting, and the team remained on the scaffolding, exchanging uncertain glances. The seconds seemed eternal as they waited for the decision that could define their fate in the project. The tension was palpable. "If this costs us the contract, we're in serious trouble," Carolina murmured. "Not only that," Diego added, "we could lose our jobs." Javier looked at the stain on the wall, and then at his hands. He clenched them tightly, as if he were holding back something he didn't want to say. Carolina noticed his expression and confronted him. "Javier, do you know something we don't?" The man hesitated before answering. "I'm just saying that." Something doesn't add up. I checked the equipment this morning. Everything was fine. And what are you implying? Diego asked, with a mixture of concern and anger. Before they could continue questioning him, Ramiro returned with bad news. They gave us an hour to find a solution. If not, they will suspend the project and replace us. The silence became heavier. Only 1 hour to reverse the disaster. But how? We can try to wash the stain before it sets on the surface, Carolina suggested. With enough water pressure, we could reduce the damage. That's not enough, Diego said. We need new paint, of the same shade as the original facade. But I don't know if we'll have time to match it. Javier looked around and clicked his tongue. There could be another way. Everyone looked at him expectantly. We could turn the stain into part of the design, he proposed. Make it look intentional. There was a moment of silence. Then, Carolina narrowed her eyes, analyzing the idea. That could work, but we would need the supervisor's approval, and fast. Ramiro took out his radio. I'm going to propose it. But if this doesn't work, we're finished. As he went down, Diego felt a chill run down his spine. Not only was his job at stake, but also his reputation. And deep down, something told him that Javier knew more than he was saying. Absolutely. Here is the formal English translation of the third text. The shadow of doubt. The wind blew strongly at the top of the scaffolding. Diego, Carolina, and Javier exchanged uneasy glances as they awaited Ramiro's response. From below, the supervisors continued to observe the blue stain on the hotel's facade, some taking photos and making calls. Every second that passed seemed eternal. What if they don't accept the idea? Diego asked, rubbing his hands nervously. Then we're lost, Carolina replied, frowning. We can't erase that stain in time, and if we try to paint over it without approval, it would be even worse. Javier remained silent, observing the stain as if searching for answers within it. His behavior had not gone unnoticed. Diego gave him an inquisitive look. Hey, you still haven't told us what you think really happened. You said you checked the equipment this morning. What else did you see? Javier took a slow breath, as if calculating his words. Just that everything was in order. There were no failures in the supports, nor signs that the bucket could fall on its own. It's strange, that's all. Before Diego could respond, Carolina's walkie-talkie rang. Ramiro's voice was heard on the other end, tense but firm. They gave us half an hour. They say that if we can present a convincing design that justifies the stain, they will consider letting us continue. But they want to see a sketch right now. Half an hour? Diego exclaimed. How are we supposed to make a sketch in such a short time? Carolina was already taking out her notebook and pencil. We have no choice. If they want a design, we'll give it to them. Think fast. How do we turn this into art? Javier crossed his arms, pensive. Then suddenly, he snapped his fingers. How about a wave? Something modern, abstract. If we add some white touches to the edges of the blue stain, we could make it look like part of an intentional painting. Carolina began to sketch quickly in her notebook, drawing lines with precision. Diego and Javier watched her attentively as the sketch took shape. The stain was transformed into the center of a stylized wave, integrating with the rest of the facade. This could work, Diego whispered, surprised. Ramiro appeared again, with a serious expression. Send the sketch up, the supervisors want to see it now. Carolina tore off the sheet and handed it to him. Everyone held their breath as Ramiro went down hurriedly with the design in his hand. The minutes passed in a tense silence. Diego felt his pulse in his ears, while Javier kept his gaze fixed on the stain. Carolina, without letting go of her pencil, drummed her fingers against the notebook. Finally, Ramiro's radio rang. His voice came through choppy, but with a mix of relief and disbelief. They gave us the green light. But there's one condition. They want Javier to be the one to direct the painting of the design. The three turned to look at each other. Javier, for the first time all day, seemed genuinely surprised. Me? Why me? They said that your name was already in the reports as team supervisor. If they trust someone to fix this, it's you. Carolina smiled slightly. Well, it seems you're the chosen one. Do you accept or not? Javier swallowed, feeling the weight of responsibility. Then, with a deep breath, he nodded. Okay, let's do it. But inside, a shadow of doubt tormented him, because he knew that the bucket had not fallen on its own. And if he accepted this task, he would have to make sure to discover the truth before it was too late. Brushstrokes of suspicion. The sun was slowly descending on the horizon as Javier, Diego, and Carolina began preparing the materials to transform the blue stain into an improvised work of art. Time was running out, and the pressure from the supervisors was felt in every movement. Ramiro remained close by, attentive to every detail, making sure that everything went according to the approved plan. "All right, we have to start by outlining the edges," Carolina said, taking out her brushes and a thinner brush for the details. "If we can make this look intentional, they might even congratulate us instead of firing us." Javier nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He still didn't understand how the bucket had fallen. His instinct told him it wasn't a simple accident. As he applied the first brushstrokes to shape the wave, he glanced at Diego, who was working on the lighter shades of the paint. "Hey, Diego, are you sure that no one else touched the bucket before it fell?" Javier asked casually, although he was watching him closely. Diego hesitated for a moment before answering. "I already told you no. It was there, secured. I don't know how it could have happened." Carolina interrupted them with a snap of her fingers. "Concentrate. If we keep going at this pace, we won't finish before nightfall." They returned to work, and little by little the blue wave began to take shape. Despite the stress and tension, there was something almost hypnotic in the movement of the brushes on the surface of the building. For a moment, it seemed that everything was going to be all right. However, Javier's unease did not disappear. There was a detail that kept spinning around in his head. Diego was a good painter, but he had always been careless with the equipment. What if it really was just a human error? Or was someone else involved? Suddenly, a metallic noise startled them. They turned in time to see how an almost empty paint can rolled across the scaffolding until it fell to the ground with a dry thud. Ramiro, who was below, immediately looked up. "Be more careful," he shouted sternly. "We can't allow another mistake." Javier frowned. The can had not been in an unstable position. Someone had pushed it. He looked around, but Carolina was concentrated on the details of the design, and Diego seemed just as surprised as he was. Then, a chilling idea crossed his mind. "What if someone wants us to fail?" he whispered to himself. He said nothing more. At that moment, the important thing was to finish painting, but his suspicion grew with every minute that passed. Hours later, when the last stroke was given and the artificial light illuminated the finished work, the supervisors observed the result carefully. The blue wave, with its white reflections and details in graded tones, seemed to have been part of the hotel's original design from the beginning. One of the supervisors, a man with a serious face and a calculating look, nodded slowly. "It's not what we wanted, but it's acceptable," he finally declared. "However, we are going to investigate what happened here. We cannot allow carelessness of this type in future projects." Javier felt a chill run down his spine. He knew that the investigation would bring uncomfortable questions, and if someone had really sabotaged the equipment, they would find out sooner or later. As the team gathered their materials and descended from the scaffolding, Diego approached Javier and murmured in a low voice, "It wasn't me, Javier, but someone is watching us." Javier felt a knot in his stomach. He looked around, and for a moment, he thought he saw a shadow move among the team's vehicles. But when he fixed his gaze, there was no one there. "They're testing us," Diego continued in a tense voice. "And I don't know why." The feeling of unease was undeniable. What if someone on the team had a hidden motive? Perhaps a rival within the company, someone who wanted to discredit them. Or worse yet, someone who knew them well enough to manipulate them from within. Carolina approached them, wiping her hands with a cloth. "Is something wrong?" Javier shook his head, as if trying to clear his mind. "Nothing, we're just exhausted." "Well, we earned it. Ramiro invited us to dinner to celebrate that we saved the project." "You better come," Carolina said, giving him a light pat on the shoulder before walking away. Javier and Diego remained silent for a moment. "Maybe at dinner we can discover something," Javier murmured, his mind still turning over his suspicions. Diego nodded. "Or maybe the culprit is already watching us." With that last phrase floating in the air, they both headed to the car. The night was just beginning, and with it, the feeling that something bigger was happening behind their backs. Shadows at dinner. The restaurant chosen by Ramiro was not exactly luxurious, but it had a cozy atmosphere. The dark wood of the tables and the dim yellow lighting created a contrast with the bustle of the city outside. The entire team had gathered there, trying to relax after the tension of the day. Javier, Diego, and Carolina arrived together and took a seat at one of the central tables. Ramiro raised his glass of wine and smiled. "Despite the disaster, we managed to save the project. I want to toast to that." Everyone raised their glasses, although Javier barely took a sip. His gaze swept across the room, looking for any indication that someone was watching them. He knew it sounded paranoid, but he couldn't ignore the persistent feeling that something was wrong. The atmosphere became more relaxed as the dishes began to arrive. The conversations revolved around past anecdotes and jokes about the biggest mistakes they had made on previous projects. Diego tried to distract himself with the chatter, but the tension in his jaw betrayed his concern. At one point, Ramiro leaned towards Javier and spoke in a low voice. "I've been reviewing the safety reports. There's no explanation for how that bucket fell." Javier swallowed. "What does that mean?" "It means someone pushed it. And I want to know who." A chill ran down Javier's spine. His intuition had been correct. There was a saboteur among them. Just at that moment, the restaurant door opened, and a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. It was someone none of them expected to see there. Expansion and additional development. The bustle of the restaurant lessened slightly as the figure advanced. It was Esteban, a former colleague who had worked with them on several previous projects, but who had resigned abruptly months ago. His presence at that moment was not a coincidence. "Esteban," Diego murmured, setting his glass down on the table. Esteban smiled sideways and approached without hesitation. "Well, what a coincidence to find you here." Javier exchanged a look with Carolina and Ramiro. They didn't believe in coincidences. There was something unsettling about the way Esteban was behaving, as if he knew something they didn't. "We didn't know you were in town," Ramiro said cautiously. "I just arrived," Esteban replied, taking an empty chair without waiting for an invitation. "I heard about your little problem with the paint. Interesting situation." The air became heavy. Carolina crossed her arms. "Where did you get that information?" Esteban let out a brief laugh. "Let's just say I still have friends at the company. And when I heard what happened, I thought it would be fun to come and see how you were doing." "Fun?" Diego retorted, in a tense tone. "That's not exactly the word I would use." "It depends on the perspective," Esteban replied. "Sometimes accidents aren't just accidents, are they?" Javier clenched his fists under the table. He knew that Esteban was implying something, but he couldn't decipher exactly what. "If you have something to say it at once," Javier blurted out. Esteban looked at them all with an enigmatic smile, and then stood up. "I just wanted to say hello. Enjoy your dinner." Without another word, he turned and left the restaurant, leaving behind an uncomfortable silence. "That wasn't normal," Carolina whispered. "Definitely not," Ramiro murmured. "We need to find out what's going on before someone else gets hurt." Diego swallowed, because if Esteban is involved, this is just beginning. With the mystery growing deeper, the night continued its course. But none of them could relax. They had managed to save their job, but something told them that the worst was yet to come. Clues in the dark. The night stretched longer than they had planned. Although dinner had ended, neither Javier nor the others could get Esteban's unsettling appearance out of their heads. After paying the bill, the group gradually dispersed. Carolina and Diego left together, murmuring about the strange coincidence, while Javier and Ramiro decided to take a walk before returning to the hotel. "I don't like this, Javier," Ramiro said with a frown. "If Esteban is here, it's not just to say hello." "I don't believe in coincidences either," Javier replied. "Something tells me he knows more than he says." As they walked through the illuminated streets, the sound of the city in the background, Javier felt a shadow move in the corner of his eye. He stopped short and looked towards a narrow alley. "What's wrong?" Ramiro asked. Javier narrowed his eyes, but saw nothing. Perhaps it was just his mind playing tricks on him. "Nothing," he said finally. "We should rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." However, the feeling that they were being watched accompanied him to the hotel. The next day, the team returned to the building where they were working. The paint on the facade was already dry, but there was still work to be done. While they were organizing the materials, Diego approached Carolina with a serious expression. "I can't stop thinking about what Esteban said last night," he murmured. "Sometimes accidents aren't just accidents. Do you think he had something to do with the bucket?" Carolina sighed and crossed her arms. "I don't know, but I refuse to believe it was a simple mistake. Someone did it on purpose." Javier approached at that moment. "If Esteban is behind this, what would he gain?" "Maybe revenge," Ramiro said, joining the conversation. "Remember that when he resigned, it wasn't on good terms." "But that was months ago," Diego replied. "Why now?" Before they could continue speculating, a loud noise startled them. It came from the materials storage area. Javier ran there, followed by the others. When they arrived, they found several paint cans scattered on the floor, as if someone had pushed them. "Again!" Carolina exclaimed. "This can't be a coincidence." Javier bent down, and picked up one of the cans. His eyes sharpened when he saw a small boot print on the floor, right next to where the cans had fallen. It was a clue. Someone was here, he whispered. What if they're still here? Diego murmured, turning his head nervously. Ramiro took out his phone. I'm going to check the security cameras. They moved away from the scene, and, in a secluded corner, Ramiro accessed the recordings from the previous night. They spent minutes reviewing the images until, finally, they saw something that made their blood run cold. At 3 a.m, a dark figure entered the storage area. There was no doubt who it was. It's Esteban, Carolina exclaimed. On the screen, they could clearly see Esteban prowling among the materials, moving things around, and, finally, deliberately pushing the cans to the ground before leaving stealthily. Diego clenched his teeth. So it's true. He's sabotaging the project. Javier felt a mixture of anger and frustration. We need to confront him. Today. But none of them imagined that the confrontation would not happen in the way they expected. Because Esteban was not acting alone. The confrontation. The team decided to act immediately. They could not allow Esteban to continue sabotaging their work. But before confronting him, they needed to make sure he was not alone. The revelation that someone else was involved kept them on alert. Ramiro and Diego reviewed the security cameras once more, looking for any clue that indicated the presence of an accomplice. It wasn't long before they found him. In one of the recordings, barely visible in the shadows, a second figure could be seen moving cautiously near Esteban. Look at this, Ramiro said, pointing to the screen. There's someone else with him. I can't recognize him, Diego murmured. But this means we're not just dealing with Esteban. Javier clenched his fists. We must catch them red-handed. Carolina nodded. I propose that we split up. Some keep watch on the site, while the others follow Esteban. If we can find out who his accomplice is, we can stop them before they cause more damage. As night fell, the team organized themselves. Javier and Carolina stayed in the warehouse, while Ramiro and Diego followed Esteban discreetly. The tension was palpable in the air. Through the streets illuminated by intermittent streetlights, Ramiro and Diego saw Esteban stop in front of a small cafe, where a man was already waiting for him. From a distance, they couldn't see his face clearly, but when the stranger turned slightly, Diego felt a chill run down his spine. It can't be, he whispered. Ramiro looked at him urgently. Do you recognize him? Diego nodded with an expression of disbelief. It's Marcos, a former supervisor who was fired last year for corruption. That explains everything, Ramiro murmured. Esteban is not acting alone. Marcos must have convinced him to sabotage our project. From their hiding place, they watched as Esteban and Marcos spoke in low voices. Then, Esteban took a small envelope from his jacket pocket and handed it to Marcos. That looks like money, Diego murmured. Or information, Ramiro added. We must stop them now. Meanwhile, in the storage area, Javier and Carolina were silent, alert to any suspicious movement. Suddenly, a metallic sound broke the calm. Did you hear that? Carolina whispered. Javier nodded and pointed towards the back of the warehouse. They moved cautiously, without making a sound. When they rounded the corner of the shelves, they saw a figure crouched next to the paint cans. Stop right there, Javier exclaimed, turning on his flashlight. The intruder was startled and ran off. Without thinking, Javier and Carolina chased after him. Through the dark aisles, the figure tried to escape, but Carolina was faster and blocked his path. Stop, she shouted. The saboteur turned around, and, to their surprise, it was a young man they didn't recognize. Who are you? Javier demanded. The boy looked scared, his hands trembling. And my name is Alex. Marcos hired me to come and do this. I didn't want to get into trouble, but I needed the money. Carolina and Javier exchanged glances. Now they had confirmation that Marcos was the real mastermind behind everything. At that moment, their radios rang. It was Ramiro. Javier, Diego and I have Esteban and Marcos in our sights. How are you doing? We caught an accomplice, Javier replied. It's a boy named Alex, hired by Marcos. Ramiro snorted. That makes it even worse. We have to turn these guys over to the police. But before they could act, a loud crash shook the warehouse. Carolina turned just in time to see a stack of paint cans begin to fall on them. Javier reacted quickly, pushing her out of the way. They both fell to the ground as the cans crashed down noisily. Chaos had broken out. Justice and redemption. The crash of the falling paint cans filled the warehouse, scattering colors everywhere. Javier and Carolina barely managed to dodge the impact. But the chaos allowed Alex to try to escape. Don't let him go, Carolina shouted, quickly getting to her feet. Javier lunged after him, running between the shelves and jumping over puddles of paint. Alex was agile, but panic made him clumsy. Just as he was about to reach the exit, Diego appeared, blocking his path. "You've come this far," Diego exclaimed, grabbing his arm. Alex struggled for a few seconds, but seeing himself surrounded by Javier and Carolina, he finally gave up. Breathlessly, he murmured, "I didn't want to do this. Marcos forced me." "We'll talk about that with the police," Javier said firmly. Meanwhile, Ramiro and Diego had already confronted Esteban and Marcos at the cafe. Seeing themselves discovered, Marcos tried to run away, but Ramiro subdued him with a quick move. The arrival of the police, alerted by the team, sealed the fate of both men. "So it was you who was behind all this," Ramiro said, looking at Esteban with disappointment. Esteban lowered his gaze, avoiding a response. He knew it was all over. The officers handcuffed Marcos and Esteban, while taking statements from the workers. Alex, still trembling, confessed everything and agreed to cooperate with justice. "This could have ended much worse," Diego said, sighing. Javier nodded. "But we managed to stop them. And now we can finish the job without further interruptions." The following days were intense, but without any more incidents. The team worked tirelessly, making sure that the building's paintwork was impeccable. Finally, after weeks of effort, the work was successfully completed. When the last brushstroke was given and the scaffolding was removed, the team contemplated their work with pride. The facade of the enormous building shone with vibrant colors, reflecting the effort of each one. "Look at it," Carolina said, with a satisfied smile. "It's worth every drop of sweat we shed. And every can of paint wasted in our battle," Diego joked, laughing. The site supervisor congratulated them, thanking them for their professionalism. Even some residents of the city approached to admire the work, taking photos and praising the result. To celebrate, they decided to organize a special dinner on the hotel terrace. Amid laughter, toasts, and anecdotes, the group recovered the spirit that the tension had tested. "In the end, we made it," Carolina said, raising her glass. "And without any more accidents," Diego added with a smile. "There's only one thing left to do," Ramiro interrupted. Javier raised an eyebrow. "What thing?" Ramiro took out a bucket with leftover paint and, without warning, poured it over Javier, covering him with colors. Everyone burst into laughter as Javier shook off the excess paint. "I knew it. It had to end like this," Javier exclaimed, laughing. One by one, the others ended up stained with paint in the middle of an improvised battle, completely forgetting the stress of the last few weeks. Under the starry sky, with the city illuminated around them, the team realized something important. Their job was not just painting buildings, but also building unforgettable memories together. Later that night, back in their rooms, each one reflected on what had happened. Javier thought about how the trust and unity of the team had overcome the difficulties. Carolina, still with traces of paint in her hair, smiled as she remembered the moment when everything seemed lost, only to discover that together they could solve any problem. Ramiro turned on his phone and saw a message from his family congratulating him. "We are proud of you," it said. He closed his eyes with a feeling of satisfaction. Diego, for his part, watched from the window the newly painted building, illuminated by the night lights. Mission accomplished, he thought. And so, with the certainty that they had done an extraordinary job and that their friendship had been strengthened, the team allowed themselves to rest. Tomorrow, a new city would await them, with new challenges and more giant walls to transform into art.